The wind had a way of coming for her, sometimes a whisper in the cottonwoods, sometimes a sharp edge that scraped the back of her neck like a cold warning. It was the wind that carried the last of him away, the man who had walked into her life like a slow-burning promise, only to vanish when the night came hard and the child in her belly was heavy with waiting. She stood on the ridge where the earth folded into sky, the dry grass tangling at her boots and the child inside her moving like a storm beneath her ribs. The wind lifted her thin shawl, pulled at the loose strands of her hair, and filled the hollows in her chest where hope had been brittle and frail. There was no name for the man who had left, only the echo of his shadow on the porch and the faint scent of smoke that lingered in the corners of the cabin they'd barely called home. She was alone now, with nothing but the child and the wind. The days bled into one another, each sun rising and falling with a silence that pressed against her skin. The land around her was wild and waiting, thick with mesquite and dry sage, with the stubborn bloom of desert lilies curling beneath the sun. She learned the weight of the sky, the way clouds could drift like slow hands across the horizon, and how the wind could carry the scent of rain even when the earth stayed thirsty. Her name was Ruth, though few had spoken it in the weeks since the man had gone. She had come from a place where the prairie stretched endlessly, where the air was thick with dust and memory. She had carried the child here, to this rough edge of the world, hoping for something steadier than the hollow beat of loneliness. Her fingers, calloused from washing clothes in the river and mending threadbare shirts, rested against the swell of her belly. The child was no stranger to the quiet, already learning to move with the rhythm of the land, the subtle thrum of life that threaded through the harshness. She wrapped herself tighter in the shawl, the fabric worn thin but warm, and turned away from the ridge. The cabin stood crooked, its boards weathered by sun and storm, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. It was a place half forgotten, left by a man who had once spoken of building something lasting, a home not just of timber and nails, but of skin and smoke. The wind had carried him off, but she stayed. The child inside her would need roots, even if the earth was dry and the sky indifferent. That evening, as the sun bled low and the shadows thickened, a figure appeared on the far edge of the clearing. The man was tall and lean, his eyes steady and weathered like the land itself. He carried no words, only a bundle wrapped in a blanket and a slow, quiet strength that settled like a promise in the air between them. He did not speak at first, but set the bundle down gently near the fire pit. The smoke from the wood curled upward, twisting with the wind as if carrying the beginning of something new. She watched him, the child stirring inside her with a sudden, sharp movement, as if sensing the change. He looked at her then, not with the roughness of the man who had left, but with the calm patience of someone who understood what it meant to come home, even when all that was left was skin and smoke. The wind folded the night into quiet. Around the fire pit, the flames whispered their own stories, sharp, crackling bursts followed by steady embers glowing like old promises. Ruth's fingers brushed the bundle he had set down, curious and cautious. The man, whose name she still did not know, had not yet offered more than a presence, but his steadiness was a kind of answer to the silence she had carried for too long. She did not speak, and he did not ask. Instead, he began to gather wood from the scattered limbs near the cabin, stacking them with care that spoke of rituals long forgotten or never learned. The wind stirred, tugging at the fire's smoke, and the night settled around them like a thin, shared skin. She watched the firelight play across his face, catching the lines carved by years of sun and weather. There was something in his eyes that made her feel as if she had stumbled onto a buried place in herself, an ache she hadn't dared to name. The child shifted again, a soft movement against the warmth of her body. "Name," she said, voice low and rough. The word hung in the air, fragile as a spider's web. He looked at her then, slow and sure, as if the weight of a name was a thing to be measured. "Elias," he said finally, his voice like the ground settling after a long drought. Ruth repeated it quietly. Elias, a name she could hold onto, fragile but real. It settled between them, a thread tying the wind to the smoke, the child to the promise of something like home. In the days that followed, Elias worked with a quiet rhythm. He repaired the cabin's broken boards, coaxed water from the stubborn earth, and hunted game with a patience that surprised her. His hands were steady and sure, his presence a kind of refuge she hadn't expected to find. Ruth moved among the small rituals of survival, gathering herbs for tea to soothe the ache in her belly, mending worn clothes, and learning to listen to the land's subtle language. The wind remained her constant companion, sometimes harsh and wild, sometimes soft as a lover's breath. One afternoon, as the sun dripped low and the sky burned gold, Elias brought her a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a carved cradle made from the gnarled wood of a fallen mesquite. The edges were smooth from careful hands, and the smell of smoke lingered faintly in the grain. "It's for the child," he said simply, voice rough but tender. She traced the cradle's curves, feeling the slow pulse of hope beneath her skin. The child kicked softly, as if recognizing the shape of safety before it even had a name. That night the wind rose with a sharp edge, rattling the cabin's thin walls and sending the smoke from the fire twisting into frantic spirals. Ruth sat close to the hearth, the cradle beside her, and watched Elias as he kept the fire alive with steady hands. There was no hurry in his movements, no promises made lightly. The home he brought was fragile and true, built not from grand words but from skin and smoke, from the slow building of trust and the silent weaving of two lives against the endless wind. The dawn came with a quiet sigh, soft light spilling over the cracked earth and igniting the dust with a pale gold. Ruth lay awake in the small cabin, the child pressing gently against her ribs, its presence a slow pulse beneath her skin. Outside, the wind was a low murmur through the mesquite branches, as if it was carrying the world's breath, steady and unyielding. Elias was already stirring. She could hear the scrape of his boots against the wooden floor, the muted clink of a metal cup. He moved with the kind of ease that spoke of long mornings spent in solitude, and yet in his presence there was no loneliness, only a quiet, enduring patience. When she finally rose, the air was crisp, filled with the scent of damp earth and burning sage. Elias handed her a cup of tea, the steam warm against her cold fingers. "Sky, clear," he said, voice low. She nodded, watching the light shift over the hills. It was a day for moving, for walking the land that might one day hold the roots her child would need. They stepped out into the open, the wind tugging at their clothes and hair, carrying the sharp tang of rain far to the west. Elias led her along a narrow trail, his gaze steady and sure, marking the subtle turns and dips of the land as if reading a map only he could see. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher, and Ruth felt the child shift with a new urgency beneath her breast. The air was thick with promise and waiting, the wind a steady companion that tugged at her soul like a distant song. At a bend in the trail, they came upon a small spring, water bubbling clear and cold from the earth. The place was sheltered, the trees clustered close like silent sentinels. Elias knelt and cupped the water in his hands, offering it to her with a simple grace that spoke of reverence. "This can be a well," he said, "a place to come back to." She drank, the cool water a balm against the dryness that had settled in her throat. The wind rustled the leaves overhead, carrying the faint cry of a hawk circling far above. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, they made their way back to the cabin. The cradle waited by the fire, and Elias moved to build a frame of poles and canvas nearby, a shelter of skin stretched tight and smoke-smudged, a place to keep the child safe when the world was too wide and wild. That night the wind came with a different voice, soft and steady, like a lullaby woven through the trees. Ruth lay against Elias' side, the child stirring gently between them. In the quiet, something shifted. A fragile thread of hope spun slowly in the darkness, a promise that even when the past was carved deep, the future could be shaped by small acts of trust. She traced the curve of Elias' hand, weathered and steady, and felt the slow building of something new. It was not the home she had imagined, but something more, built of skin and smoke, of silence shared and hands held through the long night. The wind carried the sound of the fire's crackle, the soft breathing of the child, and the steady beat of two hearts learning how to be whole again. The child came into the world in the hush before dawn, when the sky was still a slate-gray promise, and the wind whispered low through the mesquite like an old, secret prayer. Ruth's breath came in ragged waves, mingling with the smoke from the fire pit just beyond the cabin's thin walls. Elias sat close, his presence a quiet anchor, his hands steady as the land beneath them. When the baby's cry finally broke through the cold morning air, it was a sharp, fragile thing, raw and alive. Ruth's fingers trembled as she held the small, warm weight against her chest, the child's skin soft and new, as fragile as the smoke curling from the fire. Elias watched without words, the lines on his face softening in the firelight. There was no ceremony, no grand welcome, only the slow weaving of two lives bound by silence and the restless wind. In the days that followed, the cabin shifted from shelter to home. Elias built a cradle from the poles and animal skins, the frame taut and warm, smoky tendrils curling where the fire's breath met the night. Ruth found herself speaking less, but when she did, her voice was steady, anchored by the rhythm of survival and the strange new tenderness the child demanded. The land around them did not soften for grief or hope. It remained sharp, indifferent, its beauty held in the hard lines of cactus thorns and the rough bark of juniper. But within that hardness, something fragile grew, a quiet tenderness that could only be seen in the small things. The way Elias moved to gather water before dawn, the way Ruth sang low to the child in a voice cracked by weariness, the way the wind carried their breath and mingled it with the scent of sage and smoke. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and blood-orange streaks, a shadow appeared on the ridge. A woman, her face lined with years of hardship and a fierce kind of hope, stepped into the firelight. Her eyes met Ruth with something like recognition, unspoken and deep. She carried a small bundle of herbs and a sharp knife, and as she knelt near the fire, the wind stirred, lifting strands of her dark hair. There was a wordless understanding in that moment, a shared history of loss and survival, a communion born of scars no one else could see. The woman's name was Mary, and she came from a town some miles west, where the earth was kinder and the people harder but honest. She had heard whispers of the woman left with the child and the wind, and something in her had drawn her here, a pull as quiet and relentless as the breath of the land. Mary stayed through the night, tending to Ruth and the child with a knowledge born of hard years and quiet strength. She braided the baby's hair with strands of dried sage and whispered stories of women who had found their way through darkness by trusting the slow unraveling of time. In the morning, as the sun cracked open the sky, Elias and Ruth stood watching Mary walk away, her figure swallowed slowly by the dusty trail. The wind rose behind her, carrying the scent of smoke and sage, and for the first time since the man had left, Ruth felt something shift beneath her skin. The home they had built, of skin, smoke, and steady hands, was no longer just a place. It was a promise whispered on the wind, a slow-burning flame that would not be extinguished. And the child, nestled between them, was the living pulse of that promise, fragile and fierce, beneath the endless sky. Winter crept in on quiet feet, folding the world beneath a thin layer of frost and silence. The mesquite branches, stripped bare by the season's bite, creaked under the weight of icy breath. Inside the cabin, the fire's glow cast long shadows that danced against the rough-hewn walls, a fragile warmth against the cold that pressed through every crack. Ruth wrapped the child close, the small body curled against her like a flickering flame, its breath soft and steady. Elias moved near the hearth, adding kindling with deliberate care, the smoke rising in lazy spirals that mingled with the faint scent of drying sage. The winter was a test, not just of flesh and bone, but of the quiet fortitude that grew from patience and trust. The land was unforgiving, the days short and brittle, but within the cabin's walls, something stronger began to take shape, a rhythm carved out by shared labor and the slow unfolding of guarded hearts. Elias spoke little, but his eyes held a steady kindness, a promise woven through the cold. Ruth found herself watching him often, tracing the weathered planes of his face, the way his hands moved with a gentle precision, the way he listened to the wind as if it carried secret messages meant only for him. One evening, as the fire sputtered low, and the wind outside carried the hollow sound of distant coyotes, Ruth stepped outside with the child bundled tight against her chest. The sky was a sharp black canvas pierced by stars, silent witnesses to the small miracles of survival. She looked to the ridge where the wind gathered, felt its chill press against her skin, and then down to the child, whose eyes fluttered open, reflecting the cold firelight. In that moment, Ruth understood that they were all travelers, shaped by loss, carried by hope, and bound by the slow, unspoken pull of home. The next morning, Elias took down the frame of poles and skin they had built beside the cabin. The child was growing stronger, and with the coming thaw, they would need to step further into the land, to find water, to follow the slow call of the seasons, to build not just a shelter, but a life. They moved together then, two figures threading through the scrubland, the child cradled between them like a spark held carefully against the wind. Ruth's steps were lighter, her breath less burdened, as if the land itself was shifting beneath her, offering something more than survival, a chance to be whole again. By midday, they found themselves at the spring Elias had discovered months before. The water ran clear and cold, its surface catching the sunlight like a mirror to the sky. Elias knelt and cupped the water, offering it again to Ruth, who drank deeply, feeling the coolness spread through her like a healing balm. The child stirred, reaching out tiny fingers to touch the ripples, and for a moment all the harshness of the world fell away, leaving only the gentle pulse of life carried on the wind. They stayed by the spring through the afternoon, building a small enclosure from brush and stone, an embrace of earth and shadow to shelter the child from the sun's sharp glare. Elias worked with quiet focus, his hands steady and sure, while Ruth gathered wild herbs, their scents mingling with the wind's soft breath. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the land, Ruth felt the slow, steady turning of something inside her. A fragile hope woven from the smoke of the fire, the cry of the child, and the unyielding song of the wind. They had been left with nothing but skin and smoke, but in that nothing, they were building everything. Spring came like a quiet reckoning, the earth shifting beneath a veil of green that pushed stubbornly through cracked soil and weathered stone. The wind softened, no longer sharp and biting but warm, carrying the scent of blooming wildflowers and distant rain. It was a season of small awakenings, and beneath the wide, watchful sky, Ruth felt the slow unfurling of a life that was hers to shape. The child, now restless and bright-eyed, crawled through the shelter of brush and stone with an eagerness that caught at Ruth's heart. Each new step was a fragile claim on the world, a quiet rebellion against the past that had nearly broken them both. Elias watched with a gentle smile, his eyes reflecting the endless sky and the steady pulse of hope that had taken root in their shared silence. They moved through the days like a single breath, measured and sure. Elias tended the land with the patience of a man who had known loss and found grace, while Ruth gathered the wild herbs and roots, learning their names in the language of survival. The wind wove through their days, a constant thread, sometimes a soft lullaby, sometimes a fierce reminder of the past they carried like a shadow. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the sky bled colors no artist could capture, Ruth found herself alone by the spring. The child, now toddling with uneven steps, reached out to touch the water's surface, laughter spilling from small lips. The moment was a quiet kind of grace, a glimpse of a future not yet written, but already held in the fragile hands of this small life. Elias joined her then, his presence like the steady beat of a drum beneath the vast silence. Without words, he reached out and took Ruth's hand, their fingers intertwining with a familiarity that spoke of slow trust and the building of something stronger than either had dared to hope. They stood together, watching the wind carry the smoke from the fire pit up into the deepening sky. It twisted and curled, a living thing made of breath and ash, a symbol of all they had lost and all they were learning to hold. Ruth pressed her cheek against Elias' shoulder, feeling the steady warmth beneath her skin. The child's laughter echoed in the fading light, a song carried on the wind, a testament to survival, to mercy, to the quiet strength born when two lives become a home. They had been left with nothing but the child and the wind, and yet Elias had brought her a home of skin and smoke. In the fragile weaving of moments, of shared labor, silent understanding, and small acts of care, they had built something lasting. A home not of timber or stone, but of breath and trust, of patience folded into the quiet earth, and the fierce, unyielding love that grew beneath the endless sky.